You've probably heard the word diverticulosis thrown around before, right? It feels like one of those things that everyone's aunt or grandpa seems to have. But what is it really? Well, it's a story about hidden pockets, simple physics, and how something as basic as your diet can create a high-pressure situation inside your own body. So let's actually dig in and see what's going on.
So here's the game plan. First up, we're going to define exactly what these unwanted pockets are. Then we'll get into the science of pressure that actually creates them. We'll look at who's most at risk before, and this is a big one, tackling the critical difference between diverticulosis and diverticulitis. And finally, we'll wrap up with the path to managing it.
All right, so let's start at square one. What in the world is a diverticulum? Let's get a really clear picture of this unwanted pocket.
So a diverticulum is really just an outpouching of your intestinal wall. I want you to imagine a tiny little balloon or a pocket that's pushing its way through the muscular layer of your colon. And these are acquired, which just means you aren't born with them, and they pretty much always show up in the large intestine.
And we can get even more specific than that. The vast majority of these little pockets form in one particular spot, the sigmoid colon. That's the final S-shaped part of your large intestine just before the rectum. Now you gotta be asking, why there? Well, that's where the science gets super interesting, and we're going to get to that in just a second.
And that leads us perfectly into the science of pressure. See, the story of how these pockets form is actually a pretty simple tale of high pressure meeting a weak spot.
Which is the central question, isn't it? I mean, your intestinal wall is a strong, muscular tube. So what could possibly have enough force to make it bulge outwards like that?
Well, here's the key. High pressure building up inside the colon literally pushes the inner lining out through natural weak spots in that outer muscular wall. It's kind of like poking your finger into the side of a tire where the rubber is a little bit thinner. The pressure inside finds that weak point and poof, it creates a bulge. It's the exact same principle.
And get this, it turns out there's a specific law of physics that explains this perfectly. It's called the law of Laplace. Now, I know, it sounds super complex, but the idea behind it is incredibly simple. All it says is that for any tube, the narrower its diameter, the higher the pressure is going to be on the inside.
And that right there is the aha moment. This is precisely why the sigmoid colon is ground zero for this stuff. Because it's the narrowest part of your entire large intestine, it naturally has to deal with the highest amount of internal pressure. And that constant high pressure is what's seeking out those weak spots to form the diverticula. See? It's not random at all. It's just physics.
Okay, so we've got the how, now let's talk about the who. Who is most likely to develop this condition? Let's take a look at the key risk factors.
Yeah. The research points to a pretty clear set of factors. Some are just physiological, like getting older, which can weaken tissues over time. But a lot of them are tied to lifestyle. Things like smoking, obesity, and eating a diet that's heavy on red meat. Even some medications can play a part. And you can see how all these things can contribute to one major problem: constipation. But among all of those, there is one factor that just stands head and shoulders above all the rest. It is the primary driver behind this entire process.
Yep, it all comes down to a diet low in fiber. This is the master key that connects everything. See, without enough fiber, you get constipation. And to move that harder stool, your colon has to squeeze with way more force, which dramatically jacks up that internal pressure. It's the perfect recipe for the law of Laplace to do its thing. Maximum pressure in the narrowest section, creating those pockets.
Okay, this next distinction is probably the most important one in this whole explainer. I want you to think of it like a crucial fork in the road, because having the pockets is one thing, but having them get infected is a whole other ballgame. We have to understand the difference between diverticulosis and diverticulitis.
Let's break this down. Diverticulosis with an osis. That just means the pockets exist. A lot of the time, there are no symptoms at all. But diverticulitis with an itis on the end, that means one or more of those pockets has become inflamed or infected. That's when you get symptoms like sharp pain, usually in the lower left belly, and a fever. And check out the bleeding part. Surprisingly, bleeding is a feature of the non-inflamed state, not the inflamed one.
So why is that? It seems completely backward, right? Well, this quote explains it perfectly. In diverticulitis, the inflammation is so intense that it actually causes the tiny blood vessels nearby to become sclerosed, which basically means they harden up and clamp shut. So a calm pocket might bleed, but an angry, inflamed one usually doesn't.
And that inflammation is exactly why diverticulitis is taken so seriously. It can lead to some really severe complications. A perforation is basically a tear in the colon. An abscess is a walled-off pocket of infection. A stricture is a narrowing of the intestine because of scar tissue, and a fistula is an abnormal tunnel that can form between the colon and another organ, like the bladder. All of these are serious medical problems.
So, this brings us to our final section. Now that we understand the what, the how, and the why, let's talk about the path to management. What can actually be done about all this?
For simple diverticulosis, just having the pockets, there's generally no active medical treatment. The whole focus is on prevention through diet and lifestyle. Now, for uncomplicated diverticulitis, the treatment is that same lifestyle approach, but with the crucial addition of antibiotics to clear up that infection.
However, if those more serious complications we just talked about pop up, like a perforation or a big abscess, that's when surgery often becomes necessary to go in, repair the damage, and resolve the infection.
So what's the big takeaway for management? Well, it really just boils down to 3 powerful habits. First and foremost, a high-fiber diet to keep that internal pressure low. Then, increasing physical activity and avoiding a sedentary lifestyle, both of which are just huge for keeping your digestive system healthy and regular.